Welcome to this session of the Beyond the Veil Summit with my guest, Bernadette Pleasant. Our topic today is why we must grieve to heal. Bernadette Pleasant, creator and founder of the Emotional Institute and Femme, creates classrooms, courses, and workshops where all are welcomed to unlearn social conditioning that shames emotional expression. Bernadette, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome.
It is a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation because today we're going to talk about honoring grief, which is something we're really not very good at. So let's start there.
We're the worst. It's more than not good at. We have no context for it. I mean, we haven't seen it modeled well, and we avoid it, and it's so needed because there's so much of it, and quite honestly, so many reasons to grieve.
Yeah, there are, and it also seems like we're going through so much. It's bizarro world. No matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, you absolutely must admit that we are going through times that we've never experienced before. And I think a lot of people are, well, first of all, we're being forced into experiencing grief because we're losing so much, not just loved ones, but a way of life and sometimes our sanity. So we are really sort of being pressed into it. So let's start with that. How do you think we can best handle what's going on?
You just mentioned something that everyone can relate to. Everyone can relate to, and like you said, regardless of what side of anything you're on, we can all relate to the potency of this time, to the aliveness, to the forced awakening that exists, and it has taken everyone out of comfort zones, whatever they were. I mean, we were comfortable not wearing masks. We were comfortable not being 6 feet apart. We were comfortable on whatever side of political fences we were on, whatever that was. We could have that, but it wasn't layered with all that we are experiencing right now with heightened state of racial awareness on top of a pandemic. We have a coast on fire right now. I mean, there are just so many different things that there is to experience or read about. And so anytime there are three things, and that is loss of any kind, loss of freedoms, loss of a loved one, loss of the feeling of being safe. Anytime there's loss, change, and disappointment, there is breeding ground for grief. And I don't know anyone who's not experiencing all three, or at the very least, one or two of those. So there's much to grieve, and we don't have a blueprint for grieving. So we carry that around in our bodies, and we there's no language for it, and so it starts to affect everything we do, the decisions we make, how we get up and move throughout our days. The grief of change due to COVID, where everything is virtual. And the inability to reach out and touch people or go to work as one used to, with the safety of sitting around at your desk and talking to colleagues without distancing. So there's so much that is happening where there's a disappointment, whether it's spoken or not, it's alive in us, because there's change, there's disappointment, and there's loss. And those three things really create a bit of an undertow, which our lives are built on top of this thing, and there's this pull going on, whether we are conscious of it or unconscious, and lots of things, lots of ways that can be reacted upon if we don't know what it is. How it can come out sideways. We can get snarky. We can get short-tempered, depressed. There are just so many ways that if we don't stop and look at it and say, wow, that's what that thing is. That's what I'm feeling. That's what I'm noticing and sensing. If without taking that time and not without having that awareness, it can truly impact how we move throughout our days. And yeah.
Right, right. Now, I'm also wondering then, because again, we've got so much to grieve, and we're not doing it. What is it that we're also afraid of? I know I'm not particularly a big fan of it. When I lose somebody that I love, or lose my life, yeah, it really is hard to allow myself to feel the grief that needs to be felt, because chin up, carry on, move forward. Life is moving too fast. I don't have time to feel my feels.
Yeah.
So is that unusual, or is everybody afraid of feeling grief?
For the most part, yes. Grief has not been modeled well in our society at all. Someone whose work, she's no longer with us, but whose work I so deeply appreciate and follow is Sobonfu Somé. Sobonfu Somé, from West Africa, from the Dagara tribe, and in Burkina Faso. She moved to the States. She lived in California, and she'd been there for a few years. And she asked some friends of hers in that area, what do you do when you're grieving? Like what do Americans do when they're grieving? And you can imagine the looks, people, the blank stares, we medicate it, or we keep it to ourselves, we hide it. We don't have a model for grieving, and yet we all do it. And so I recall hearing what her response was, which I always thought was just epic. She said, well, that explains a lot. So what she began to share was what happened back home for her. They always had what was considered a grief ritual going on somewhere. There was always something to grieve, and grief was not something to be feared. It was something to be experienced. No one looked forward to experiencing grief. However, if you live, if you care to dream, if you love, grief can follow that because of loss, disappointment, and what was, I just mentioned the third one, change. These three things will always exist, but they had a ritual for grieving, for processing this thing, for allowing for whatever sound or movement needed to come out of your body. This was something not to get over, but to get through. And their belief was that by experiencing the grief, you no longer carried it as heavily. I often think of grief as like a pile of shit. And stay with me on this one, that if you step in it, if you don't take the shoe off and clean the shoe, and like that, wherever you go, it goes. Wherever you step, it's there with you. And grief needs to be looked at. It needs to be investigated, cleared, so that there is this freshness, this new life. Grief is a bit of a stopper clutter. It can just clutter in our hearts, even the way it feels in the body. And it becomes this very sensitive place that builds. But when we, rather than say, I'm fine, I'm okay, put on a happy face, power through, become a workaholic, shopaholic, sexaholic, you name it. Those are all things that's covering something that's very real, that's there. And so by admitting I'm grieving, I'm sad, something that seems so courageous to do, to allow yourself the time and the tears, there's something that comes as a result of that, something new, something fresh, something that opens up for more possibility, more life force. More life force comes through expressing, acknowledging grief.
Hmm. That makes so much sense. Thank you for that. I'm also wondering what you were saying brought another question to mind. If we have lost a loved one, specifically, and we're unable to grieve them, and we're carrying that around with us, it almost feels like I want to be very careful how I say this because I don't want to be insulting to anybody who's doing this, but it almost feels like by holding on to that grief, you're almost creating a lack of connection with your loved one who's on the other side of the veil, who you could possibly be communicating with. Have you found that holding on to grief blocks that?
I don't think holding on to grief, I think it can if there's an attachment to the loss. And yes, and the loss is real. The loss is real. We are missing having someone physically in our lives and not considering any other possibilities. And it really becomes about our loss and not in those moments, certainly not about the possibilities of what's there. So yeah, grief is the grief that I'm referring to is acknowledging pain. And once you do that, and it's okay. I mean, there's a natural grieving process if we allow for it. But when you have allowed that to happen, when you've given yourself that compassion, just maybe you can consider any kind of communication with that person or what messages their life force brought to you or continue to share with you. You can be open to that. And yes, the loss of their physical is there, but now a whole new realm of possibility can open up for some. I say that because, of course, everyone's not open to that possibility, but I personally am, and I think it is refreshing to think of what becomes possible after loss of a loved one. Loss of a loved one is one way of grieving. There are actually what's called 5 gateways of grief, and the one that we do recognize is that everything we love we can lose, and that by all means exists. But then what becomes possible as a result of that loss? What did we learn? What messages may be there for us from the other side? How are they looking out for us and wishing and wanting and pointing us in directions? Can we still feel and sense them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Now you mentioned that there were 5 gateways to grief. Would you like to go ahead and share the other 4?
Sure. 5 gateways of grief. The second gateway of grief is, and these are things from Francis Weller's Wild Edge of Sorrow, which I just absolutely adore, that book. But the places that have not known love is the second gateway. And those are places in ourselves that we may not have celebrated. We may not have, that we may have disdain or shame around, some creative parts of us that, it could be even one's sexuality, something that is not seen as acceptable. So I think of somebody stuck in a corporate job who really is an artist. There's some part of them that is not loved and celebrated. So that's the second gateway. Sorrows for the world, the third gateway. This is when, well, right now is a very good time to we can point at so many different directions right now. Racism, a pandemic, global warming, things that seem so large that you don't know how little old me can impact change, or how have I helped to create this problem in some small way. But it just seems so large that you don't know where to begin and how you individually can make a more positive impact. That's one of the gateways. What we expected and did not receive. This could be someone saying, I care. I see you. Uh, Acceptance from tribe, village, um, things that were ancestrally passed on, traditions that you feel like you should belong to some group. It's something that many haven't experienced, but these are things that live in the body. Like somewhere, my people were to be somewhere, or someone was to come and care. And the last is ancestral grief, and we're seeing a lot of that these days with the racial uprising. There's a lot of ancestral grief and shame. These are things that are inherited. So the example I like to give is my mother could not have given birth to me in the 60s in the US without concern about how I would be received. Would things be better for me? That concern about your offspring, that's in the bones. It's and so therefore the child comes in with that concern, that grief, that worry, and that can happen to for anyone. Shame for ancestors past, that it's in the tissues. Sometimes they're just, you can't even put your finger on it. I'm feeling this low undertow of emotion and I don't even know what's wrong. And sometimes it's shame around grief. Like, I have nothing to grieve. My life is good. I shouldn't feel the way I do. There are people with, experiencing far worse. So there's so many things and avenues and gateways into feeling grief.